In this episode of the Omega Podcast, we have a seasoned guest, Carlo Leboffe, on retaining top talent, debunking quiet quitting, and resourcing job candidates for the new normal. Take a listen. Welcome to the Omega Expert Chat with Carlo Leboffe, a senior manager on the talent and acquisition team at MorganFranklin Consulting, and supports the firm across all lines of business. He possesses 16 years of recruiting experience across several verticals. Carlo also works on internal projects and provides support to clients as needed. He works with corporate teams to identify areas for process improvement, which have included ATS solutions, digital transformation efforts, and incorporating emergent tools, applications for targeted sourcings of high-demand skills across functional and technical areas. Carlo, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Keenan. I appreciate it. I'm really happy to be here today.
Yes, it's, again, great to see you and great to have you here. When you originally started your career trajectory at MorganFranklin as well as other institutions, what was your initial fascination or reason for seeking talent acquisition as a career path?
Good question. So I'll be upfront and tell you, and many other people in this field probably have similar answers. A lot of people jokingly say they fell into recruiting, so I might be the same. It wasn't necessarily like my career path out of college. I actually studied marketing and was going to go in the route of like in-game advertising for a specific field, but I happened to intern at a large staffing company, enterprise company at the time, and I had a job offer and, went great the first year. So I just kind of fell into that. I did that for about 5.5 years. And then I went to MorganFranklin Consulting, who at the time, they were actually a client of my company's. And so when I met with the founders and some of the executive team, just kind of talked through my capabilities and hit it off from there. And I've been here ever since. I've been here a little over 12 years.
That's fantastic. Staying in one particular corporate environment for more than 2, 3, 5 years is commemorable, especially in our day and age where
it's unusual.
Gen Zers are constantly moving around to different companies every 3 years or so. And when it comes to recruiting, I don't think people understand all that goes into it when it comes to relationship building, networking, meeting students and professionals from different backgrounds. What has been sort of the exciting piece of recruiting for you throughout your career? So what kind of is that generating energy that you gain from this career?
Yeah, I'd say starting off when I used to be in staffing, it would just be the sort of the game of, hey, I would work with clients or candidates and be able to place them and kind of see that impact that I would make real time, right? With MorganFranklin Consulting, I'm supporting the business, right? So it's a little bit different. I'm supporting one company, but internally, I have many different clients, you could say. And so what I've enjoyed is being able to see, again, my direct impact, right? So, hey, individuals who I'd hire who would then, go on to build out practice areas or service offerings or, see that kind of interconnected activity where you can see people really become successful and then maybe later on pull you into things, right? So that's always been a really big driver for me is like, hey, I could see the success of, hiring the right individual, the right talent who understands the business, understands the company, is very motivated. And, you see the benefits of that longer term, right? Because again, you have the relationship, they can pull you into things as needed. And in general, it's also good to develop very strong relationships across the board, right? With hiring teams, with, executive teams, because you never know, like certain conversations you could just get pulled into and maybe you weren't thinking about initially supporting one area. Maybe you were apprehensive or hesitant, but, through that success, you hire the right person and boom, it could really take off.
Yeah. And I think when you touched upon hiring the right candidate, I feel as though that is actually probably one of the most challenging areas of your role, right? Being able to hire the right candidates. And throughout your career, you've hired hundreds of individuals, top talented people in different verticals within your company. For recruiters that are listening to this conversation, what might be some key areas hiring managers should evaluate when hiring that right candidate, what do you think are maybe 2 or 3 key areas, skill sets, or maybe even behavioral aspects that a hiring manager should be considering when looking at the right candidate?
No, that's a great question. So I'll caveat this answer by saying every company hires a little bit differently, right? I think there are certain core skills across the board that can make anybody successful, especially if you're talking about consulting, right, in this industry. But, for Morgan Franklin, let's say, to use that as an example, we look for things like or maybe previous professional services or consulting experience, because those individuals to a degree would have a level of understanding of, just how projects are completed, how to run through that process, some base expectations. But beyond that, you start getting into more of like the functional technical requirements, what he or she needs to know. But at a higher level, probably more important level, it's okay from a culture personality standpoint, right? And that's where I say every company is a little bit different, because hiring managers across different companies are going to be different with what they need, right? And what makes a person successful for their environment, right? If you're looking at like a large enterprise environment versus a startup, very different, right? And so same person is not going to be successful in both environments, right? So you have to understand, okay, well then it's a question of what makes somebody successful. Well, it's a variety of things, but key factors is that person engaged and should, and you can tell, like, hey, if before you even talk to them, have they gone to the website, have they studied up what you do, like, can they answer those couple of quick questions? If they can't, well, it depends. I mean, they might have all the skills on paper, but then are they really going to be that invested, right? And you can tell early on when you have those conversations. And I've even told our hiring managers here too, and I've had friends that work for other companies, you always want to pursue the individuals who show that interest, right? Who are very engaged and who have the mindset of just want to be progressive, want to advance their careers. Like that type of mindset does very well, not just here, but really anywhere, right? And granted, different people fit different environments. So I never speak negatively about one environment versus another. They're just all different, right? So understanding those expectations is going to be really, really helpful, because again, it's not like you're constantly looking for core skill sets across all the same companies, right? No two people are the same, right? So it could make things more difficult, but in theory, when you consider, okay, well, what are some key things that my company looks for, right? As a firm, or, from like a culture standpoint or environment standpoint, and that's going to be different at different places, right? So understanding that is key. And I was actually talking to, one of my colleagues earlier about this, is that, everybody's a little bit different. They have their own nuances, their own way of thinking about things, who they in particular might feel could be successful here, right? So that's very important when you consider candidates at any level, right? Apart from just their technical or functional skills.
Yeah, and I think it's important for any candidate or applicant going into applying to companies like, Mega Consulting, Morgan Franklin Consulting, because if you don't have an understanding as to what that culture is, what that environment entails, you might be in a way setting yourself up for failure. So having those initial conversations and, from a recruiter's standpoint, being able to acknowledge, those behavioral patterns, are they invested? Are they giving 110% in the interview process? Because I truly believe that is the only indicator for future success. If they're not involved, giving 110% at the interview stage, or maybe even starting at the company, how do you expect them 10, 15 years when you're looking for your next partner or, engagement manager? Those particular attitudes and behaviors are going to be what's said in those internal conversations. So that's incredible for those that are doing the right things, making sure they're putting in their best effort. But as you talked about briefly, when it comes to that culture narrative and understanding, how to work for the best companies with the best culture for mobility, how should hiring managers, integrate D&I into their hiring decisions when it comes to finding the best candidate, but in a more diversified way based on perhaps their skill sets, based upon maybe their upbringing, where they are originally located, if they have an ability that perhaps isn't internally staffed? How should maybe hiring managers approach that if they have a pool of candidates that come from different particular backgrounds?
No, that's another strong question. Great question. So, and this is actually something that's ongoing with us currently too. In fact, we even recently went through a training, and we're still continuously looking at that. And I know obviously D&I is a big diversity, is a big topic these days. But the number one thing is really just to remove any and all biases, right? As much as possible, especially when you're talking about like the hiring process and, assessing pools of candidates, because you really have to be so objective and just look at, okay, well, what are the core things that are going to make somebody successful, right? And you really just have to kind of let go of any pretense. And it's not easy, it's easier said than done, right? But at the same time, there are a lot of tools out there today, and there are ways to incorporate that into your hiring process more and more. So that way, it's not going to make it, I'd say, any less easier, but at least you are removing those biases right from your process, and you're now just considering the candidate in and of themselves, right? So that way you don't really have to think about that or worry about that. And I would say, honestly, we've been fairly successful as far as being at the forefront of that. At least, from a TA function, we've always kind of kept that in the back of our minds and made sure, like, hey, are we considering this? Looking at everything from the website to our job descriptions to internally, culturally, like how we're adopting like the policies, making sure that we don't have biases when it comes to considering candidates at every level.
Yeah, and I know that there's tons of training and software solutions that are out there to kind of help, managers or individuals kind of really be adaptable and understanding as to how this plays a significant role. Because, if your team is not a reflection of your clientele, there's a problem, of course. And that's why it's important to have these conversations internally and to be able to say, how do we bring in the best talented individual to our teams and eradicate those biases? And obviously it's much easier said than done, but if you're putting it at the forefront and having the conversation, I think that's the first step that any corporation should take in order to resolve that, if that is a particular issue, depending on the company. But again, even with all that being said, it goes back to hiring the best qualified individual. What would you say would be some of the drawbacks of, for instance, hiring a candidate, right? Maybe out of school, because we know that you perhaps may have never worked with them before in this context, but learning how to, see, again, going back to those behavioral things, but what might be sort of those blinders that, for instance, maybe recruiters have that maybe they should be more aware about when hiring a new candidate, a partner, for instance, in those types of processes? What sort of
that's a good question. It's an open-ended question. I'd say, one of the biggest, I don't know, I necessarily know if it's a drawback, it's just you can never anticipate what people will do, right? Once they're onboarded, you can't control that. And so trying to anticipate that, it's just going to become a never-ending task for somebody, right? You can't really think that way. All you can do is really prepare as much as possible in order to have, people come on and onboard successfully. And really it starts with setting up the expectation, right? Whether it's, with a specific role or opportunity or whatever you're hiring somebody for, right? It's making sure that person knows exactly what he or she is getting into as much as possible. So that way, they can hit the ground running and be successful. And I think, to our benefit, like the hiring teams here, at least MorganFranklin, have done a really good job of trying to set that expectation more and more over the years and have more clarity around those things, right? But yeah, ultimately, even if you do that, you still can't anticipate what people might do, right, within their first year or even sooner. And certainly there are cases where on paper somebody could look great, right, in terms of the skill set and check off every box, and they could end up not being there within the first 3 to 6 months just because, hey, personality, culturally, they're not a fit, or maybe they didn't really realize what they were getting into, from the beginning. Part of that could be, again, setting up those expectations, but part of it just could be on that individual, or like maybe they weren't very clear as far as like, did they communicate what they really intended, right, when they took that job, right? Did that come across in the interviews, right? And again, you can drill down and nitpick and really look at the data and see, okay, did we ask everything as much as possible? Did we set up those expectations? Do we make it clear from the get-go? How do we onboard them, right? But then sometimes, there's just cases where it falls through, and you can't plan for that. You can't anticipate that. You're dealing with people. It's a people business, right? So you have to do as much as you can on the front end to, try and make sure that you set up, again, people for success and kind of have parameters laid out so it's very clear and specific.
Yeah, the clarity and transparency, I would often argue, to be most likely the most important areas of that process. The clearer and the more transparent from a recruiter as well as from a candidate perspective it is, again, it leads to that success in the long run. but I know there's a particular term, it's called quiet quitting. It has been going around for the past couple of months now, and I'm actually still wrapping my mind behind it. But one of my colleagues shared with me that it's actually not too much of a new
Yes.
ways. I mean, people quit. I mean, obviously, but I think when that term quiet quitting comes into the room, you're like, quiet quitting? Who's quiet quitting? I think because we're in a hybrid modality with people working in the office, people working from home. I mean, those that are probably working from home, they kind of have that leniency to be able to kind of do what they want, and it may or may not have a reflection on their job performance. When it comes to recruiters, or maybe even from a manager's perspective, when it comes to quiet quitting, what do you find to be, your fascination when it comes to that? Have you noticed that that has been a particular trend, maybe within other organizations? And what would be your approach to mitigating that? Perhaps like facilitating relationships with your employees more, checking in, providing surveys to really check in on individuals to see how they're feeling, how they're doing. I mean, right now it's a holiday season, so people are gearing up to take time to spend with their family or friends. But what would you say, as a manager, has been the benefit of, that relationship building to avoid, quiet quitting or the distancing of those that might be working virtual or might be in different parts of the globe?
Yeah. All good points, and I'm smiling as yeah, this because I agree with your friend in that it's not something new in my opinion. It's just the reason why this is. I guess to answer your question, what I'm fascinated with is like, wow, this is such a big topic. It really isn't, in my opinion. I think the job market in the past few years, because of the pandemic, has put a spotlight on it, and that's why you're seeing all of this come to light. But the reality is, it's always been happening. You know what I mean? And so number one, you always want to develop a good relationship regardless. That's always key, and it's only going to be to that employee's benefit too, or candidate, as they go through like the whole candidate journey and hiring process. But what was interesting to see in the past like 2 to 3 years is, on one hand, this whole idea of the great resignation and quiet quitting is because of the fact that everything flipped remote, right? And not only that, job opportunities just skyrocketed, right? Because at one point, everybody was hiring for almost every function, right? I found myself talking to my friends and say, hey, you know what? They're hiring for this. You should go check this out. Or, I know you're looking for something new. And what that did was it really drove up the concept of within the job market, like the idea of like, well, hey, I'm very comfortable. I have all these opportunities left and right. So it doesn't really matter. And this is more so not about like resignation and quiet winning, but when it comes to like candidates interviewing and, the whole concept of ghosting, right? Because unfortunately, like, a lot of companies, especially larger companies, would, quote unquote, ghost candidates. But that's also happened on the reverse side too, where, candidates just don't get back to you. Or I would say they're less concerned nowadays with how they would appear to a prospective company if they don't follow up with them or don't continue the interview process, right? Well, because why? Well, I have, these 4 or 5 other opportunities, so I'm just going to choose like the best 2 or 3 or best one. And oh, I don't get back to the company. Oh, well, it doesn't really matter. I'm not burning any bridges because I didn't establish one to begin with, right? So that's what I've personally experienced myself and what I've seen. But what's happened now, especially within the last year, that's shifted. So a lot of companies who have hired up a lot of people and put them in positions that say that maybe they weren't really suited for has really kind of shifted the job market. So now people are starting to, have a tighter grip and say, oh my gosh, there's a recession coming, and maybe let's see, are they going to have the same mentality? Yeah, I don't know. Probably not. I would hope not. But that's what I've seen happen, right? So again, get back to your point, the idea of this quiet quitting, I think just in a remote environment, we're 100% remote, even though our physical offices are still up, and some companies have taken different approaches, but it's not easy. You have to understand like how to keep engaged with your employees, especially in a remote environment. That's not easy. It's more difficult, but to our credit, like we've put certain things in place where we've been successfully being able to virtually do a lot of things, continue moving, continue functioning, and continue onboarding. But a lot of companies are looking at this and how do you keep people engaged, right? Because when you're remote, it's very easy to just get lost, right? And you don't see somebody. It's not like you go into the office every week, and it's a completely different mentality, right? And so how do you make up for that loss, physical, site like contact, when you're not in the office all the time, right? And not that I'm not saying, hey, I'm supportive of going back to a being in the office every day type of work week, because I would definitely see the value being fully remote. But at the same time, it's just being cognizant and aware of, okay, well, if that's going to be the case, how do you continue to keep your company employees engaged, right? Because you need to have some kind of structure in place. So that way they don't lose sight and they don't lose connection and they're not on islands by themselves, because over time they'll drift. And then, yeah, if they're not feeling connected, and, I've even come across this too, and other employers have, where some people maybe wanted to at the start of the pandemic and you wanted to be in office, right? And it's difficult because they're at home all day, working at home all day, and then that can be just become tiring, right? You can hear about all that Zoom fatigue and call fatigue, etc. So it's not an easy question to answer. I just say but every company has to figure out how to really keep that level of engagement, right? And then the answer is going to be different depending on where you work.
Yeah, that's very well said. Very well said. And I know you had touched upon it briefly regarding the recession. And I know there's been a lot of discussions about it. And it seems as though the way that everything is moving, I was just checking the recent unemployment rate in the US right now is 3.7%, which is approximately 6 million people are unemployed. So people are on the hunt looking for jobs right now. And when it comes to candidates preparing for interviews, or for instance, they've been called back, what are some pieces of advice that you would give these individuals for your company?
Yeah, so I am very objective when I talk to people, and I tell them like, hey, there are situations where even if it doesn't work out, like the interview process works out where, hey, we don't end up moving forward with that individual, but I do my best to say, hey, I'm happy to stay in contact with you, and you've taken the time to go through our process. At a minimum, I'm happy to, let's say, stay connected on LinkedIn and perhaps even, hey, refer you somewhere else, right? I don't do that with every single person just because there's no way we can keep up that that type of volume. But the job market, at least to this day, is such where I tell people, hey, at a minimum, you're going to find something, right? That's the right fit. That's, the right role, whether it's with us or not. Now, obviously, if it's somebody who we want to hire, okay, well, we probably want to do our best to coax that individual to join the firm, right? But in general, when you're talking about like the job market and the recession, I mean, from what I've seen so far, yes, it's definitely changed from the last year to 2 years, right? But there's still a lot of opportunities out there depending on the industry, right? So there's still a lot of companies still hiring, right? So it's just a matter of finding the right thing, right? And I don't know if it's going to shift back up where it was, 2 years ago to a year ago, where, again, it was very, very busy, right? Everybody was hiring for everything. I think companies have adjusted and realized like, oh, did we overhire? Did we, move too fast in one direction? Because it was a very quick, as soon as the pandemic hit, like, oh, digital transformation became a real term, and people they actually had to like implement a lot of that. Some companies like the Amazons and Googles of the world were already set up to handle that from the beginning, but most weren't, right? And so they really had to shift and adjust, and that led into, oh, we need to maybe cut some staff and this and that. And so, long story short, kind of a long-winded answer to your question of you shouldn't be so concerned as far as, okay, well, I need to either get this job or not. It's more so, are you, again, I go back to the point of, are you invested? Are you interested in that opportunity? And are you positioning yourself to the best of your ability to like speak to it, right? And it shows. I don't expect people to be, to your point, 110% prepared in an interview, as long as, hey, they give me 25%, meaning you've been to the website, you can at least tell us what we are as a company, right? As opposed to me asking you and you saying, I have no idea what you do, and you apply to us. It would be different to say, hey, if I went out and found somebody on my own, they weren't necessarily looking for a new opportunity. Well, that's my job because I'm supposed to be doing that, right? But I would have a certain level of expectation if somebody reached out to us, or if I applied to any other company for that matter, the expectation I would hold on myself is, I'd done enough research to at least speak to it to a degree, right?
Yeah. And I know that you touched upon like making sure that the individual showing that initial interest, of course, but with the job market the way that it is, the necessity and the types of skills that are needed for companies have shifted with digital transformation, digital skill sets, understanding of how to utilize, the Zooms and Microsoft Teams and Google Meets. It adds an additional responsibility on the candidates to know. What would you say would be a particular skill, or maybe a technological skill, for instance, that would help a candidate stand out in this job market today?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily fault anybody if they're not super well versed in, any of these applications where they weren't previously used to it before, right? Because every job is a little bit different. But if you're talking in the context of consulting, then yeah, I mean, there's certain base things like I expect you to know how to use PowerPoint, right? And like Office 365 to a degree, right? If you haven't, well, I don't know how successful you could be anywhere else, let alone somewhere here, right? So there's certain like base level things. In general, I think just given the state of the world today, most people would know like, yeah, I can turn on a computer, I can, and we certainly don't require anybody to have like these on hand. In fact, many times throughout the interview process, any company these days, they share that with you, right? So they'll set it up for you. You don't have to, just download a link into your browser and that's it, right? So what wouldn't change, I guess my answer is, just your ability to communicate and articulate yourself and, articulate like what you do, right? Because you're the only person that can speak to that, right? So your ability to summarize that and articulate that to a hiring manager or hiring team, like that's always going to be important, right? Regardless of whatever technical or functional skills you might have. Because a lot of times people would view, your ability to communicate, your presence, and just your thought process and add more weight to that versus, all right, well, do you know SQL? Can you write reports? Can you do this, right? Some things can be taught and others, view that they can't, right? And so it depends on who you talk to, by the way, when you ask this question, but hiring teams are going to say different things. But that's my opinion based on what I've seen, right? Is that's always going to be a level of importance is your ability to communicate very clearly.
Any final thoughts that you would like to share to our listeners?
Final thoughts? No, not really. I appreciate the time and thank you. And I don't have as a huge robust career as Keenan makes it out to be, but I'm very, very humbled and thankful that he had me on this podcast.
Wow. Well, thank you, Carlo, for being on the Omega Expert Chat.
Thank you.